Yeah, so I was presenting data from the CHHiP trial. This is one of the largest ever clinical trials in localized prostate cancer. The trial was comparing standard radiotherapy, that's giving 74 gray over 37 fractions in 7.5 weeks. That's the standard way we used to do radiotherapy for localized prostate cancer, and comparing it to doing that in a sort of shorter fashion, what we call hypofractionated radiotherapy, where we squeeze the radiotherapy into 4 weeks rather than the standard 7 weeks. And the idea being that, first of all, it's a benefit for patients. You get the treatment done quicker, they like that. But also scientifically and biologically, there's a good rationale that giving the radiation in a shorter period of time will have an advantage in terms of efficacy in curing more prostate cancer. So it was a very large trial, well over 3,000 patients randomized to 3 arms. One was the standard arm, 74 gray in 37 fractions, and then there were 2 experimental arms, 60 gray in 20 fractions and 57 gray in 19 fractions. Yeah, so the primary endpoint of this study was biochemical failure, and it was designed as what's called a non-inferiority trial. So what you're trying to find out is you get your standard arm, which you know works well, 74 gray in 37 fractions, and you have to compare these 2 experimental arms, and by statistical analysis you can determine is it as good as or the same as or worse than. So the measure that we used was called biochemical recurrence. So essentially patients where their PSA, which is a biomarker in prostate cancer, where that was raised significantly after the treatment, we determined that was a recurrence of prostate cancer. And the new data we're presenting today, we already had presented the 5-year follow-up data some years back, and now this is 10-year data. So it's really long-term follow-up of a lot of men who've had this treatment. And what we found, first of all, is that we confirmed that 60 gray is probably the best of those 3 doses, and that it's at least as good as the standard arm, whereas 57 gray seems to be a little bit less effective in terms of biochemical control. So we found that, and the other very important piece of data in these group of patients was the toxicity. Because for many of these patients, it's pretty easy to cure these patients. They have a very, very high cure rate, probably well over 80%. But what's different between surgery and radiotherapy might be the toxicity rates, particularly with regards bladder and bowel and sexual function. And what we showed in this 10-year data is, with regards bladder and bowel side effects, they really are quite low overall, less than 2% of patients experiencing problems 10 years later. And this is very reassuring for patients just about to start radiotherapy for this type of prostate cancer, that first of all, the cure rates are very, very high. The chance of dying from this prostate cancer are very low. In fact, the chance of developing a metastasis is less than 5% at 10 years, which is really amazing. But very importantly as well, the risk of a serious long-term complication that would be life-altering is very, very low indeed, which is reassuring, I think, at this stage. I think it really shows the strength of UK clinical trials. I think there are very few countries that could do a trial of this huge scale and have, well over 3,000 patients recruited within a few years. So it's really testament to really excellent NHS clinical trial ethos. Well, what's interesting is that, first of all, this has really proven the point that giving radiotherapy in a hyperfractionated way, so giving a bigger dose per day over a shorter period of time, that principle works. And really the next phase is the PACE trial, which data was also presented here today, and that's really shortening the radiotherapy much more, down to 5 treatments. So that's really the direction of travel for radiation. So highly precise, very accurately delivered radiation using high-tech machines like CyberKnife and very complicated linear accelerators. And this type of stereotactic radiotherapy is really the way forward, because this allows us to really spare tissue, try to protect the bladder and the rectum and the other organs that might be damaged, and to give this in a very, very efficient way. So I think that's the next step. Also, for patients with slightly higher risk localized prostate cancer, adding drugs to the mix can be a help as well. And there's a lot of work going on into which type of drugs might be added to prostate cancer in due course, added to radiation in prostate cancer in due course. Overall comment from the CHHiP trial is that 10 years later, we see excellent efficacy data. So this maintains the very high level of prostate cancer cure from this type of radiotherapy, showing that 60 gray in 20 fractions is just as good as 74 gray, and also showing that the late toxicities at 10 years are really quite low and very reassuring for patients.